The War of Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, cost more in real economic terms than any conflict between the 30 Years' War and World War I, devastated European economies, reshaped the global balance of power, created the British Empire as we know it, gave birth to modern public finance and the Bank of England, and yet most people have never heard of it, couldn't tell you who fought in it or why or what it accomplished. And this obscurity is strange because the war's consequences shaped the next 3 centuries. It determined that Britain rather than France would dominate global trade, that the Spanish Empire would decline while the British rose, that the modern system of great power politics and balance of power diplomacy would emerge, that governments would learn to borrow on unprecedented scales to finance warfare, creating the national debt and central banking as tools of state power. And the war accomplished all this at staggering cost, perhaps 400,000 to 700,000. Military deaths, unknown civilian casualties, economic devastation across Europe, the near bankruptcy of every major power involved. And yet it remains forgotten, overshadowed by more famous conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars or World War I. Despite being more consequential than many better-remembered wars, and understanding why this war happened, how it was financed, and what it cost reveals fundamental truths about how states compete, how war and finance are inseparable, how the ability to borrow determines the ability to fight, and how the most expensive conflicts aren't always the ones we remember, because historical memory is shaped by narrative and national mythology rather than by objective importance. And the War of Spanish Succession, despite its enormous cost and consequences, doesn't fit neatly into national narratives, doesn't have clear heroes and villains, doesn't resolve into simple stories. And so it fades from memory, while lesser conflicts remain famous. The war began with a succession crisis. King Charles II of Spain died childless in 1700, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. And the question was who would inherit the Spanish Empire, which despite Spain's decline remained the largest empire in the world, controlling Spain itself, the Spanish Netherlands, much of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas. Whoever controlled Spain would control this enormous empire and its wealth, particularly the silver flowing from American mines, and 2 dynasties had claims. The French Bourbons through Louis XIV mother and wife, both Spanish princesses, and the Austrian Habsburgs through their kinship with the Spanish Habsburgs. Charles II will named Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV grandson, as heir, and Louis accepted despite having previously signed treaties agreeing to partition the Spanish Empire. And this triggered alarm across Europe because if France and Spain united under one dynasty, the balance of power would be destroyed. France already dominated continental Europe militarily. If it also controlled Spanish resources and empire, no coalition could resist it. So England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria formed the Grand Alliance to prevent this. Their goal was to put the Austrian Habsburg claimant, Archduke Charles, on the Spanish throne instead, and what followed was a truly global war, fought in the Spanish Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Spain itself, and in colonial theaters in the Americas, involving essentially every major European power and many minor ones, and lasting 13 years with only brief truces. The financial cost was unprecedented. England spent approximately £93 million on the war, roughly equal to the entire English GDP at the start of the war, and this doesn't count indirect costs or economic disruption. France spent even more in absolute terms though less relative to its economy. The Dutch Republic nearly bankrupted itself. Austria was perpetually in financial crisis. And all of this money had to be raised somehow, through taxes and borrowing, and the mechanisms developed to finance this war would reshape how states operated. England before 1688 had limited ability to borrow. The king's credit was personal, unreliable, and constrained by Parliament's unwillingness to grant taxes. But the Glorious Revolution of 1688 established parliamentary control of finance, and this enabled systematic borrowing. Parliament could credibly commit to repaying debts because Parliament controlled taxation, so investors would lend to the government at reasonable rates. And in 1694, the Bank of England was created specifically to help finance war. It lent the government £1.2 million in exchange for a charter and the right to issue banknotes. And this began the system of permanent national debt, where the government would borrow continuously, rolling over debts rather than paying them off. and the debt would be backed by Parliament's taxing power, and this system worked. England was able to borrow far more than France despite having a smaller economy, because English credit was better, because Parliament's backing made English debt more secure than French royal debt, and this financial advantage proved decisive. England could keep armies in the field year after year while France, despite being larger and richer, struggled to pay its troops and maintain supplies. The military campaigns were led by some of history's greatest commanders. The Duke of Marlborough on the Allied side proved himself a tactical genius, winning major victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet, crushing French armies that had dominated Europe for decades. And Prince Eugene of Savoy fought brilliantly for Austria, and together they repeatedly defeated French forces and pushed deep into French territory. But despite military success, the Allies couldn't win. Decisively, France was too large to conquer, too resilient to collapse, and Spain itself supported Philip of Anjou, the Bourbon claimant, so the attempt to impose Archduke Charles by force failed. Meanwhile, the war dragged on. Year after year, battle after battle, siege after siege, and the costs mounted. Marlborough's victory at Malplaquet in 1709 cost over 20,000 Allied casualties, the bloodiest battle of the 18th century to that point. And while it was technically a victory, the losses were so severe that it broke support for the war in England. People began questioning whether the objective, preventing Bourbon Spain, was worth the endless bloodshed and expense. And this is the pattern of expensive wars. They start with clear objectives and righteous causes, but as the costs mount and years pass, the objectives blur, the causes seem less compelling, and war weariness sets in. The peace negotiations revealed that nobody had really won. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 and subsequent treaties in 1714 left Philip of Anjou on the Spanish throne, the very outcome the Allies had gone to war to prevent. But with conditions, France and Spain would never unite. Philip renounced any claim to the French throne. Spanish territories in Europe were partitioned. The Spanish Netherlands and much of Italy went to Austria. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, and crucially, Britain gained the Asiento, the right to supply slaves to Spanish America, which would prove enormously profitable, and Britain also gained territorial concessions in North America. So while the Allies failed to achieve their stated war aim, they gained enough to claim victory, and France, while keeping Philip on the Spanish throne, had been bled white financially and militarily, had lost its military dominance, had seen its economy devastated. So France could also claim to have achieved something, but at catastrophic cost. This was a war where everyone lost, even though some gained relative advantages. The cost was so high that any gains were Pyrrhic, and yet the war permanently altered the European balance of power. France never recovered its former dominance. Britain emerged as the primary naval and commercial power, and the stage was set for the next century of Anglo-French rivalry that would culminate in the Napoleonic Wars. The connection to the South Sea Bubble is direct. The War of Spanish Succession left Britain with enormous debts, and various schemes were proposed to manage them. And the South Sea Company was created in 1711 partly as a device to handle war debt. It assumed government debt in exchange for exclusive trading rights to Spanish America, rights that depended on the Asiento that Britain was negotiating in the peace treaty. So the South Sea Company was entangled from birth with the war's legacy, and when the war ended, the trading prospects proved far less valuable than imagined. Spain granted very limited trading rights, just one ship per year, but the company used war debt conversion and financial manipulation to inflate its stock price, creating the bubble we discussed earlier. So the war that nearly bankrupted Britain led directly to the financial scheme that would bankrupt thousands of investors and require decades to unwind. The war's financial legacy was disaster piled on disaster. The immediate cost of fighting plus the longer-term cost of the schemes invented to manage that cost. And this pattern repeats throughout history. Expensive wars create debt crises that spawn financial bubbles and schemes and eventual crashes. The War of Spanish Succession led to the South Sea Bubble. World War I reparations led to Weimar hyperinflation. Wars create financial consequences that echo for decades. The reason the War of Spanish Succession is forgotten despite its enormous cost and consequences has to do with how historical memory works. Wars are remembered when they fit national narratives, when they have clear victors and villains, when they involve dramatic turning points, or existential threats. The War of Spanish Succession fits none of these patterns. It was a coalition war where everyone suffered and nobody clearly won. It didn't threaten any participant's existence the way World War II did. It didn't have Napoleon or Hitler, didn't have a clear villain. Louis XIV was aggressive but not evil, was pursuing dynastic claims that had some legitimacy. The war's objectives were abstract, maintaining balance of power, preventing French hegemony. These don't resonate emotionally the way defending freedom or defeating tyranny do, and the war's outcome was ambiguous. Philip stayed on the Spanish throne, but under conditions. France lost, but wasn't destroyed. Britain gained, but at enormous cost. So there's no simple story to tell, no clear lesson to draw, and therefore the war fades from memory despite being more expensive and consequential than many famous wars. It doesn't serve anyone's national mythology. The British can't claim unambiguous victory. The French can't claim glorious resistance. The Spanish experienced it as a civil war and occupation, not as a national triumph. So nobody has incentive to remember it, or commemorate it, or teach it prominently. The economic impact was immense and lasting. The war disrupted trade across Europe and the Atlantic, destroyed agriculture in contested regions like the Spanish Netherlands and northern Italy, diverted enormous resources from productive uses to military spending, and left every participant heavily indebted. England's national debt had barely existed before the war. By its end, it was over £40 million and growing. And this debt would never be paid off, just rolled over and expanded in subsequent wars, becoming a permanent feature of state finance. France's fiscal situation was even worse. Unable to borrow as efficiently as England, France relied more on taxation and on financial expedients like selling offices and monopolies. And the war pushed these mechanisms beyond their limits, contributing to the fiscal crisis that would eventually lead to revolution in 1789. So the War of Spanish Succession's financial consequences lasted 8 decades, culminating in the French Revolution, which was triggered partly by the fiscal crisis created by wars including this one. The war's cost compounded over time, like interest on debt, growing until it became unbearable and the system collapsed. And this is the hidden cost of expensive wars, not just the immediate damage but the long-term fiscal burden that constrains governments for decades, forcing higher taxes, crowding out productive spending, creating debt crises and financial instability, all consequences that outlast the war itself by generations. The demographic impact was also severe, though harder to quantify. Military casualties were perhaps 400,000 to 700,000, which doesn't sound enormous by World War I or II standards. But the population of Europe was much smaller, and these casualties were concentrated among young men, and many more were permanently disabled, and civilian casualties from disease, famine, and direct violence in contested areas like Catalonia and Bavaria were substantial, though unrecorded, and the disruption to commerce and agriculture reduced living standards and probably increased mortality even in areas not directly affected by fighting. So the total demographic cost was likely over 1 million deaths in a European population of perhaps 100 to 120 million. That's nearly 1% of the population, comparable in percentage terms to American losses in the Civil War. And the economic opportunity cost, what Europe might have achieved if those resources had been invested productively rather than destroyed in war, is incalculable but enormous. The war consumed a decade of Europe's wealth and hundreds of thousands of lives to achieve ambiguous political outcomes that might have been negotiated without fighting. This is the fundamental tragedy of the war, that its costs so vastly exceeded any possible benefits, that even the nominal victors would have been better off accepting a compromise in 1701 rather than fighting for 13 years. But once started, wars develop momentum, create their own logic, become impossible to stop even when all sides would benefit from peace. The military lessons learned from the war shaped European warfare for a century. The war demonstrated the importance of logistics and supply, of maintaining armies in the field for years, of coordinating coalition partners, of fortification and siege warfare. Marlborough's victories showed the potential of aggressive maneuvering and decisive battle, but Malplaquet showed the costs. And subsequent European wars became more cautious, more focused on maneuver and siege, less on bloody battles. The wars of the mid-18th century were more limited than the War of Spanish Succession. partly because everyone remembered its enormous cost and tried to avoid repeating it. But this lesson faded, and by the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the cycle repeated: total war, mass mobilization, enormous cost, and the pattern would repeat again in the world wars. Each generation forgetting the previous century's expensive wars and having to relearn through their own catastrophic experience. That major European wars are ruinously expensive and achieve little worth their cost, but the lesson never sticks, never becomes institutionalized in a way that prevents the next war, because the decision-makers in each generation don't personally remember the previous catastrophe, haven't experienced its costs, and believe that this time will be different, that this war will be quick and decisive and worth fighting. The colonial and global dimensions of the war are often overlooked but were crucial to its long-term impact. The war was fought not just in Europe but in the Caribbean, South America, and North America, where English and French colonists and their Native American allies fought for control of territory and trade. And these colonial dimensions would prove more important than the European ones, because Britain's gains in North America and the Asiento access to Spanish America laid the foundation for British commercial supremacy in the 18th century. The war began the process of Britain displacing France as the dominant colonial power, a process completed in the 7 Years' War decades later. In this colonial reorientation, Britain focusing on naval and commercial power, while France remained focused on continental military power. This would define the next century of competition. Britain building a maritime empire while France sought European hegemony, and Britain's maritime empire would prove more profitable and sustainable, generating wealth that enabled further military spending in a virtuous cycle from Britain's perspective, a vicious one from France's. So the War of Spanish Succession's global implications were profound even though the colonial fighting was peripheral to the main European campaigns. The war established patterns that would govern global politics for 2 centuries. The comparison to modern expensive wars is instructive. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost the United States trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of local lives, and achieved ambiguous objectives at best. Removed Saddam Hussein and the Taliban from power, but didn't create stable democracies or eliminate terrorism or secure American interests in ways that justified the costs. And like the War of Spanish Succession, these wars will be forgotten by future generations, will fade from historical memory despite their enormous cost, because they don't fit simple narratives, don't have clear victors, don't represent existential struggles. They're expensive, ambiguous conflicts that achieve limited objectives at disproportionate cost, and in a century, they'll be footnotes, just as the War of Spanish Succession is now. And this reveals something about how societies process expensive wars. We remember the wars that fit our mythologies and forget the ones that don't, regardless of actual cost or consequence. And expensive wars that don't produce clear outcomes get forgotten fastest, because nobody wants to remember spending vast resources for ambiguous results. It's psychologically easier to forget and move on than to confront the waste. The War of Spanish Succession's most expensive legacy was the financial infrastructure it created: the permanent national debt, the Bank of England, the system of deficit financing. All of these were invented or greatly expanded to finance the war, and they became permanent features of the modern state. And this financial infrastructure enabled much larger wars in the future. World War I would have been impossible without the ability to borrow trillions and mobilize entire economies. And World War I's cost would dwarf the War of Spanish Succession, but the mechanisms were the same: borrowed money, central bank financing, deficit spending, all invented or perfected to fight an earlier expensive war that's now forgotten. So the most expensive war you've never heard of was expensive not just in its direct cost, but in how it created the machinery for even more expensive wars in the future. It was the first truly modern war in financial terms, the first war financed primarily by borrowing rather than by accumulated treasure or immediate taxation, and this financial model became the template, proving that states could fight beyond their immediate means by mortgaging future tax revenues. And this discovery, that debt could finance present wars by borrowing from future generations. This was perhaps the war's most significant and most dangerous legacy, because it removed the main constraint on war, the need to pay for it immediately, and enabled the much larger and more destructive wars of the 20th century. which couldn't have been fought if governments had been limited to current revenues and couldn't borrow. So in teaching governments how to borrow for war, the War of Spanish Succession inadvertently enabled the most destructive century in human history. And this is why even forgotten expensive wars matter. Because their legacies persist long after the wars themselves fade from memory, the institutions and techniques and lessons learned become embedded in how states operate, shaping future conflicts in ways that compound the original cost. The War of Spanish Succession cost perhaps £100 million and 700,000 lives directly, but its indirect cost through the institutions and precedents it created, through enabling future wars and debt crises and financial schemes, is incalculable and ongoing. Expensive wars never really end. They just transform, their costs echoing through the generations in forms too diffuse and delayed to clearly attribute to the original conflict, but no less real for being invisible. And this is why the most expensive war you've never heard of might actually be more expensive than any war you have heard of, once you account for its long-term consequences and legacies. Once you recognize that it invented the financial machinery that would finance centuries of subsequent wars and debt crises. Once you understand that historical importance and historical memory aren't the same thing, that the wars we remember aren't always the ones that matter most, and that expensive wars are expensive not just in immediate terms, but in how they reshape institutions and set precedents and enable future catastrophes that dwarf the original conflict. The War of Spanish Succession began this pattern, was the first expensive modern war, the first war financed by permanent debt, and therefore perhaps the most consequential war between the 30 Years' War and World War I, despite being forgotten by everyone, except specialists, remembered not at all in popular culture, barely taught in schools, invisible in our collective memory. Yet its consequences shaped the world we inhabit, from the British Empire it enabled to the financial systems it created to the patterns of warfare it established, all still with us, all still affecting how states compete and how wars are fought, and how debt is used to finance present needs at future cost, making it quite possibly the most expensive war you've never heard of, expensive in ways we're still paying for, 3 centuries later, not knowing that the bill traces back to a forgotten conflict over who would inherit Spain.